Well, let's shift our focus now to Niger. The West African Debt Management Agency says that the country missed a debt payment of $22 million last week. Now, that payment was due on February the 16th. This, of course, now brings Niger's total default to some $519 million. That's since its suspension from regional financial markets following the July coup that we saw oust President Mohamed Bazoum. Now, Niger has also been subject to sanctions imposed by the Conference of Heads of State and Government of the West African Economic and Monetary Union. The country announced last month, along with neighbors Mali and Burkina Faso, that it was leaving the Economic Community of West African States effective immediately. The regional bloc has a summit planned for February 24th to discuss the situation further. Well, let's now delve further into what is happening with Basil Abia, a policy analyst and co-founder of Veriv Africa, which is a Pan-African data insights company. He joins us now in Abuja with a deeper look at this situation. Great to have you on the show with us, Mr. Abia. Now, of course, one has to wonder, is this default a surprise, given, of course, that Niger has been subject to sanctions recently? And for you, Mr. Abia, what does it signal about Niger's economy right now?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question, and it's a pleasure to be here tonight. To answer your question, the default wasn't that unexpected, if I'm being honest. Mostly because of the scale of the sanctions imposed on the economy and the country. Obviously, that restricted financial transactions for them. It restricted access to crucial financial resources. Very important to give you context to the socio-economic context to Niger. It's the seventh largest producer of uranium in the world, and paradoxically, it's also one of the world's poorest countries, one of the world's biggest aid-dependent countries on the planet. 40% of its yearly budgets are funded by aid money, which is roughly around 2 to 2.2 billion US dollars, based on records that are publicly accessible now. And then we have to also look at the context of the sanctions imposed, both by ECOWAS and, of course, the entire world. You know, ECOWAS, for instance, restricted Niger to accessing their assets, Niger's assets, domiciled, of course, in the Bank for West African States, the BCEAO. It froze all of those assets. It suspended commercial transactions with banks, domiciled in West Africa, banks functioning with the West African financial market. The European Union, of course, being Niger's biggest contributors, or one of Niger's biggest contributors, suspended all of its financial support and cooperation with regards to security and economy, roughly about 130 million US dollars in yearly, I would say, aid. And that's the same. That's a similar case with that of France. France in 2022 gave aid worth up to 130 million US dollars, forgive me, to Niger, and it was expected that the aid money for 2023 and 2024 was going to be significantly higher. I mean, this context also with regards to records with the World Bank, Niger has one of the largest portfolios domiciled with the World Bank, about 4.5 billion US dollars, and they received 600 million US dollars in the budget funding between 2022 and 2023. So if you couple this together with sanctions imposed by the Netherlands, sanctions imposed by its neighbor, its big neighbor, Nigeria, about 70% of its electricity is gotten from Nigeria. Then you have situations where electricity supply over 80 megawatts, close to 100 megawatts, stopped being supplied over to Niger. It was definitely coming. The debt default was definitely coming with all of the numbers and the scale of imposed position. And then what does this tell for Niger's economic state? They're struggling, having access to crucial financial resources to carry about, just normal, I would say, financing work, especially when it comes to paying salaries or taking care of their debt obligations and many of these things, or even carrying out capital projects. It's becoming increasingly difficult. Obviously, they're looking towards China and Russia, but the situation is really bleak with regards to the situation.
Now, it is interesting because back then, analysts were projecting growth of 6.9% in the country in 2023 and 12.5% in 2024. So there was some positive sentiment in terms of the country's economic outlook. And I have to ask, was Niger already headed towards a default before this coup happened? Or did this happen all because of the political situation?
Well, it's important for nuance to be here. I mean, yes, analysts were very positive about growth numbers and growth rates. With countries like Niger, any sort of growth is actually significant. So the numbers, the GDP growth just scales up. And that's because of the current state of the economy, even prior to the coup or even prior to COVID. So I would say that the economic outlook wasn't really pleasant as many people would suffice. It was actually fragile. And it's important to also get some geographical context. Niger's relationship with Nigeria is multi-century. These are two countries that have been together over hundreds and hundreds of years. And then, of course, colonialism ensured that we had a boundary. So we are always aware of what's happening in Niger because we have friends, we have families, and we have very good working relationships with the analysts down there, especially the non-government-based analysts, the ones who don't really work with the governments of the day. So we were always getting feelers that situation right there was really bad. Of course, let's not forget, it's one of the world's poorest countries. It's really difficult to get private growth entrenched there. There were some significant capital projects like the refinery, of course, the Chinese aid, helping out, but the economic outlook was fragile. It wasn't all rosy. Was it on the brink of default prior to the coup? I do not think so. In fact, I would say that significantly the coup, as with the ensuing imposition of sanctions and, of course, starvation of financial resources, crucial financial resources, might I say, definitely escalated and catalyzed the situation into the current debt default. So, yes, the coup did lead to the default, but it wasn't necessarily going through a default risk. The economy, however, wasn't as rosy as analysts had painted it to be.
Well, in light of this, one has to ask, can Niger's economy survive this current economic situation? Because the junta did come out and say they're reducing spending by about 40%. What also does it reveal, this latest default reveal about the current political management and economic management of the country? Can the economy survive these sanctions?
That's a tough question, but I will provide all of the anecdotal as well as the empirical data needed to give context to this conversation. First and foremost, can they survive? Of course they can survive. They would obviously need to have access to alternative sources of funding. And generally, when you look at the geopolitics of Sahelian states and West Africa to an extent, the alternative sources of funding is definitely from Russia and to an extent China. They have obviously now announced that they will be leaving the ECOWAS bloc, and that includes all of the financial relations that they have with the ECOWAS bloc. So all of their assets with BCEAO and all of the banks that obviously are governed somewhat by the BCEAO. It means that the assets will no longer be domiciled with these institutions. So they will have access to those assets. I do not know how long that will take, but again, they can survive with shrewd statesmanship. Important to put context there to what is happening in Niger. The Prime Minister of Niger, Lamin Ali, or Ali Lamin Zanbi, forgive me for the pronunciation, but Ali Lamin is the Prime Minister of Niger. He has worked for the African Development Bank. He is a French or France-trained economist, financial economist, might I add. So he has experience with maneuvering financing when it comes to continent-wide financial resources. He was the country representative of the AFDB in Ivory Coast, Chad. If I'm not mistaken, I've forgotten the other African country, but 3 West African countries that he was the country representative for, AFDP. So he has experience. He also has very vital contacts. So it now depends on how the military junta can shepherd together with Ali, with, of course, Ali, the current prime minister, and find ways to ensure that there is a reconnection of Niger's financial system with that of the alternative financial systems, and most of them are obviously led by Russia and China. Then it remains to be seen how reciprocative that support is going to be accorded to them. Russia have their own strenuous issues. The Chinese, not really, but if you notice, the last 10 years, Beijing has been withdrawing a lot of their financing help with regards to sub-Saharan Africa. So it is a really tough ask. It's difficult to tell, but their ability to survive these sanctions will depend on these particular factors that I've highlighted. How quickly can they ensure that they entangle themselves from the West African financial bloc, get all of their assets on POSIT, use all of those core financing from those assets to pay all of their debts or most of their debts, and then reconnect with either the Chinese or the Russians or any other alternative options out there, and see what it might tell. But again, I have to add that internal austerity measures that are going to be implemented by this particular junta will definitely lead to social anxiety. And we all know what happens when there's social anxiety. There's a propensity for another coup by mid-ranking officers or lower-ranking officers to happen. So it's difficult to answer, but I'll be honest with you, it is possible with very shrewd statesmanship, and I do not think that Niamey currently has that level of statesmanship required.